All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody here for this lunchtime program that we are doing on deconstructing rape culture. I think this is a really very extremely important topic for us to be discussing as a college community with our students. So I have a panel today of folks that have joined me. So what I'd like to do is go around, everybody introduce themselves first so we know who's on the program. First and foremost, my name is Joe Thompson. I'm the Assistant Director for Student Development at Stockton. And I will be moderating this panel today as we discuss this topic. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, how you doing? My name is Michael Killebrew. I am a junior political science major, and I am a brother of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated.
Jenna?
Hi everyone, my name is Jenna Martino. I'm a criminal justice major with a minor in victimology, and I am the Panhellenic Council president.
Cassandra?
My name is Cassandra, and I go by the pronouns she, her, hers, and I am the president of Stockton's Coalition for Women's Rights, or Women's Co.
And Yamira?
Hi, my name is Yamira. I'm a sophomore. I'm an undeclared major, and I'm vice president of the Coalitions for Women's Rights, or Women's Co.
All right. And we might have somebody joining us shortly as well, but we're going to get started. So I want to thank everybody on the panel today for joining us. As I said, we'll be discussing a little bit about the important topic, the sensitive topic of rape culture. So just a forewarning for anybody who is watching this program, we will be discussing this topic. We know it's a very sensitive topic, particularly for survivors of sexual assault. So the first question I want to ask the panel, and the way we'll do this is, everyone can chime in, we'll go around and each person can kind of answer the question, participate. So the first question is, when we talk about rape culture, what exactly are we talking about? What is rape culture? Who would like to get us started?
I can start. So rape culture, how I've learned it, has been ideologies or laws or policies or individual attitudes and behaviors that support the subordination of women and violence against women. So that can be on the individual level, the institutional level, or the cultural level, and just practices that reinforce that idea that like women are able to avoid sexual assault victimization. It's their fault for being victimized. And I know that we talk about rape myths later on, but that's basically like the premise of what rape culture is.
Okay, great. Anyone else?
Yeah, can I add on to that? Cool. So I see rape culture as being kind of like the societal concept where like sexual assault and violence against women is kind of like normalized or like ignored because of the attitudes that we have as society. Like example of this could be like the whole controversy of like the friend zone, like trying to get out of the friend zone and stuff, and like other examples that we're taught from like a young age that kind of build up until it does form this like rape culture.
Yeah, I wanted to say basically what Cassandra said. It's how I see, the way I see it is how society trivializes sexual assault, or how we normalize it with things from jokes to victim blaming and to teaching boys particularly to not take accountability. The whole boys will be boys thing, things like that. We just normalize it and we shift the accountability away from abusers.
I could also add, it's like when people try to say, "Oh, it's not joking about sexual assault," it's like locker room talk, kind of like that, just trying to make it normal, I guess, in a way, which is not supposed to happen.
Yeah, for myself, I agree with everything that's been said. I think about everyday rape culture that, we might see walking around, even on, Stockton's campus, or, when we're out. And certainly as a man, I think about the way that that men treat women, particularly when they're trying to, looking at them as objects or sexual conquests. The language that they use, the actions that they take that they think are appropriate, that kind of society has unfortunately deemed as acceptable, just, yeah, some of those things that I think about. So, that being said, what are, when we talk about rape culture, often we talk about myths around rape culture, right? So what are some of those typical rape culture myths that we might hear?
If it's okay for I to start, I think a major myth that's carried on is that sex workers cannot be taken advantage of, and that partners like a husband and wife, or and also that men can't be abused too. I think those are some very important myths that people need to be more aware of, I would say.
Yeah,
I think too, one of like, oh, sorry. One of like the biggest things that I think of is like the ideal rape victim. So someone that's victimized by a stranger, like they fought back, they screamed, there was a weapon involved. Like when we know that most victims are victimized by someone they know, like an acquaintance or a family member or a partner. And not all victims fight back because it may be dangerous for them to fight back, or they're just like freeze up because they're really afraid. And that most rapes aren't completed with a weapon. So if someone doesn't fit into that ideal rape victim, people either don't believe them or they're not credible. So I think that's important to understand, like the facts of like what actually occurs in victimization, and that is like a rape myth in itself.
Yeah, I think that point is extremely important, and that's the one concept that I always talk to people about, because you're absolutely right. The majority of sexual assaults that occur are acquaintances, people that they know. It's not necessarily, yeah, this person with a knife in a back alley. It's it's a situation where someone's taking advantage of someone. Typically, there might be alcohol or something else involved. It could be a family member, right? We don't talk about that enough as well. And that's extremely important in terms of understanding kind of how these situations come to be. Also in terms of victim blaming, right? So some people might say, like, how were you sexually assaulted by your boyfriend? They're your boyfriend, so how is that rape? It's still sexual assault if you're sexually assaulted. It doesn't matter what your relationship with that person is. So I think that's a really, really important point. Thanks, Jenna.
I could also add on to that. I feel something that happens a lot when people discuss rape culture is kind of what Jenna was alluding to, is a lot of the time if you don't come out right away with your story, because it's a very sensitive occurrence that can happen to someone, and it violates kind of like their human rights in a sense. So people don't always feel comfortable reaching out, and if you wait a while, sometimes people just choose not to believe you because they think you have some sort of ulterior motive, and they don't kind of respect the healing process that comes after experiencing like that kind of trauma.
That's a great point, Jackson. When that reminds me of the fact that we're seeing this a lot in the political landscape right now. Particularly, I'm thinking about the Supreme Court nomination from a year or two ago, and or with other politicians and people coming out 10, 20 years later and saying this person sexually assaulted me. And so many people don't believe them. They don't want to believe them. And they immediately say, well, if you were sexually assaulted by this person, why didn't you come out right away and file a report? And I think that's a really important point that you just made, that it's not an easy thing to do, right? There's a lot of trauma involved in that. So thanks for making that point.
I think a lot of victim blaming also comes from the fact that people have a hard time accepting that abusers can be the people that we view as the nice guy or the very charming person. So they have a hard time accepting that a person that we hold in such high regards is capable of something so bad. So it's easy for them to blame the woman. What were you wearing? No, that can't be true, but he's so nice, things like that.
Great point.
Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like too, like one of the biggest things what you kind of started talking about, Joe, like how when celebrities or people like of high political power like get these positions and like people come out and say like, oh, like they sexually assaulted me, it's not because they want like the limelight. In most cases it's more of that they can't bear to see someone who victimized them be honored and have a really high position and like have all this power. It's more of just like an outrage that a person that should be in jail or prison is making decisions for the entire country. Like it's just more aggravating than anything else, I would say. And most women lie about rape. That's like one of the biggest rape myths, and it's not true. Like only like 2% of women lie about being raped, and it's just like really unfair to kind of put that on someone, because like that's basically saying like, oh, your experience, we're not gonna recognize that at all. Like how you were victimized, it just doesn't matter. So I think it's really important to just believe it at first and then find if something is not true. Don't just automatically believe it's not true.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And on like a kind of like a little bit of different note, I know we talked about it briefly before about like consent and stuff. But also the fact that like coercion in relationships, like oftentimes it's like we said before, between like partners. And it's oftentimes like they're coerced into making a decision. It's not doesn't necessarily have to be with like drugs or alcohol or anything, or like with violence. Sometimes it's just simply like you normally do this, like why aren't you doing it now? And then also there's also a myth that like people who with like disabilities, people who are not able-bodied cannot get sexually assaulted, when in fact like disabled people, I think the statistic is like 2 times more likely to get sexually assaulted than the standard population, which I think is like really important. Then also that like there's this notion that like reporting sexual assault and getting help for sexual assault like is a lot of money, when in fact there's like a lot of things that kind of help people like to support people when reporting. So I feel like that deters people from like actually reporting, is this like fear of like not having enough money to do so.
Yeah, I want to touch on that idea of coercion for a second. That makes me think about the Aziz Ansari situation a few years ago, and his behavior. For those that are not familiar, he went on a date with a woman, and they went back to his apartment, I believe, and he wanted to have sex with her, or at least have her perform sexual acts on him, and she said no, and she didn't want it. And throughout the night, he just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it until she did it. So there are people who think that the fact that she eventually said yes and did it means that it's okay. But I would obviously disagree, because again, it's that act of coercion and just pushing and pushing and pushing until the person relented or felt that they were unsafe in that situation and that they weren't going to be able to leave unless they did engage in sexual activity. So that I think that in itself is a situation that I don't think is a foreign concept to a lot of men in our society. When I was a college student, I heard plenty of guys that would talk about, not about it. Obviously they're not going to say I coerced this girl into having sex, but what they had to do to kind of eventually she agreed to it. And that in itself is really scary. And what does that say about what kind of healthy relationships does this person want to have in life, where they feel like to have a healthy sex life, they have to push people into having sex with them. You know, and, you know, I think we talk about rape culture. I think that coercion piece is more common than we think it is. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Rebecca's joined us. If Rebecca would like to introduce herself.
Sure. I was having some technical issues, so I was a little late. My name is Rebecca Longo. I'm the Assistant Director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Center, and I am the lead advocate for survivors of sexual assault here at Stockton University.
Thanks, Rebecca. So just to bring you up to speed, we already addressed, you know, when we talk about rape culture, what exactly are we talking about? How do we define rape culture? And we've just been getting to a conversation about what are some common myths around rape culture.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks for getting me caught up to speed.
Yeah, welcome to the conversation.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm sure you guys have already covered some of this, but for myself, rape culture can look like several different things. It's obviously not a myth. I interpret it as two pillars. The first one being the normalization of violence and sex, and the attempt to place the full burden on victims. Just to kind of jump back in. All right, thanks.
Thank you. All right, so does anyone have anything else to add regarding myths around rape culture?
Oh, I think another thing is that I feel like male victims are viewed as weak, especially if their abuser is a woman. And I think that's a really big myth that needs to really be touched on, because the same way that a woman could feel coerced by a man could feel coerced by a woman often. And I think there's like this whole idea that like masculinity or manhood being aggressive and dominant, and I think that's something that needs to be strayed away from. And being a woman means being submissive, and I think that's what it all goes into, with the whole idea that if a man is a victim, then he's weak.
Thank you for bringing that up. I 100% agree with you. Masculinity, healthy masculinity is actually something that I focus a lot of my time and energy on in terms of talking about and in trying to teach students about. So I 100% agree with you. I think this idea that, you know, heterosexual men in particular are supposed to be going after women. And I mentioned before sexual conquests and how we kind of treat women, look at them as objects. That in itself, and there's a lot of men who don't think they do that. But again, there's a lot of subconscious kind of, you know, their behavior comes out. They're not actively saying like, oh, I'm going to do this, but with their mindset and the way they think, it is what they're doing. And that's kind of something I always talk about too, because of these societal expectations, how we're raised in this culture. You know, masculinity is a social construct, how we're kind of taught to be men. You know, it's not like we set out in the morning and say, this is what we're going to do, but through our actions subconsciously, it's, you know, these things come into play. So I think that's really important to mention. I'm glad you said that. And also, you know, off of that too, I think about the fact that, you know, within my work over the past decade, I've also dealt with, you know, thinking about rape culture and sexual assault as it pertains to homosexual relationships. I was working through a situation with some folks where, and this probably happens more often than we know about, but we had a situation where there was an openly gay individual who was having sexual relationships with someone who wasn't out, right? And the power dynamic there that existed because that one individual was afraid of being outed. They hadn't come out of the closet to anyone, including their family members and most of their friends. So they were in this situation where the person who was out kind of held this power over them. And it did result in some issues. It resulted in a reported sexual assault. You know, so because the person felt that they were basically coerced into continuing this relationship and having sex because of this power dynamic. So when we talk about rape culture and we talk about sexual assault, we're talking about everyone on the spectrum in terms of gender and sexual orientation, right? So that being said, we've kind of just mentioned men and masculinity. I oversee the fraternity and sorority community at Stockton, and we're the ones that are partially hosting this program right now. And we have fraternity men that are on the panel, so they know this is a topic that I often talk about. We do programming on. What do you believe is the role of men in preventing sexual violence? Let's talk a little bit more about that.
I could start off with that. I think one huge part that a man can do is to just always be aware, to just, always look out for others, and to know that if you are in a situation where you see that you can make someone uncomfortable, to take a step back and to just be decent about it, and to just be an active listener in how others feel about things, and just kind of be involved with the conversation around this as well, because a lot of people think about sexual assault and violence against women like that, and it makes them uncomfortable. But think about a lot of times, I feel like with men especially, don't think about it from a woman's perspective of having to live with this kind of fear that it could happen to you. So I think it's just really important to normalize the conversation around it, and to just be an active listener and a supporter for women.
I would also add on to that. We also have to teach others about consent, because consent is a very important thing that when it comes to having a sexual relationship. So knowing about that is also important, just because if somebody doesn't know what consent is, or they aren't taught in the right way, they could do something that would definitely harm the other person.
Well said. I guess for myself, I feel that men play a really important role in this as well, in lots of different ways. We can't ignore the fact that victims, whether they're male, female, non-binary, children, or adults, usually the perpetrator almost always identifies as male. And that's not to be exaggerated further to say, oh, all men, or no, not anything like that. But we do need to acknowledge that no matter the victim, this is usually where this source is coming from. So why is this happening? What is happening to our males that is making this more okay? I don't think anybody raises their son to feel like it's okay. So where does this come from? And sometimes challenging that more. And also, the men here listening, you have so much more power than I think you give yourselves credit to really combat some of the areas where that's coming from. Men listen to men a lot. And when they say, hey, that's not a funny joke, or hey, you mentioned something that happened with your girl the other day that sounded really weird and messed up, why would you do that? I don't know how much men realize that has a huge power and influence on those around them. Men play a huge role. They can play a great role.
Kind of building off like Rebecca said, I think like the only way things change is just calling people out. Like you just literally just have to build up the courage, just be like, hey, like I don't agree with that. Here's why. Here's some research why. Maybe you need to educate yourself more on what this is all about, because there's so much research out there. Like it's insane. Like if you literally just search sexual assault and rape on the Stockton Library, you'll come up with thousands and thousands of articles that are like peer reviewed and scholarly and just have so much support for them. Like I just think education is one of the biggest things. And if you're an educated person, it's kind of your responsibility to make sure that your friends and people around you understand what you believe in and why it's important. So yeah, definitely just calling your friends out when they're saying things that are not supportive of women, or because that too, like it's not just specifically about sexual assault, it's just like women in general. If you're, marginalizing women based off of something that you say, that kind of puts them in that subordinate position and puts them in a place where they're more vulnerable. So just in general, breaking that stigma.
I also feel like on like a similar point to what Jenna was just saying about like education being like a really key component, not just for like men, although like men do play like a really big part. I feel like it's really important to include like all gender identities, because it's everybody's role to look out for each other. You know what I mean? Like at least in an ideal world, you know. So that means like everybody should be holding their social groups accountable. Like my group of friends holding them accountable. Like Rebecca was talking about like and Michael's talking about like locker room speak, and also about like taking victims seriously, not victim blaming, speaking out against like microaggressions, as well as like victim blaming and gaslighting too. And then like it really is important to like really broaden your knowledge about rape culture and just education about like survivors, sexual assaults, and all those kind of things. That way you can teach yourself and teach other people like that rape is not acceptable, and instead of teaching the don't get raped mentality, to really focus on like the don't rape mentality. And like also like with that, like practicing like enthusiastic consent, like some people were saying before in the call, like not even necessarily having it be sexual, like with your friends, asking them before you can like give them a hug, be like, hi, like, is it okay if like I hug you? Like, I feel like you need a hug. Like, is it okay if I hug you? And kind of opening up that conversation where consent, it doesn't always have to be sexual. Consent can just be, you know, like respect, like I respect you. And that's kind of what we're trying to build towards, is consent being respect. So you want to respect your partner, respect people enough to really make sure you have their voiced consent and their enthusiastic consent all throughout like what you're doing and stuff.
I love that you brought up enthusiastic consent. That's always one of my favorite ways of phrasing it, especially when you're having a conversation with someone who is saying, well, I mean, there was consent, but there kind of wasn't. So was it consent? The goal should be enthusiastic consent, or at least clear consent. I always like that phrase as well.
I think when I think about this piece too, I think about, you know, as a man, I guess as, you know, anyone, but no one ever wants to think that their own behavior is inappropriate, right? And again, I mentioned before, no one sets out the day saying I'm going to sexually assault someone, but it's through their learned behavior and what they think is okay, right? Nobody ever wants to think that what they're doing is inappropriate, but it's important for, I think, people to step back and again think about, how is it that I am trying to engage in a healthy relationship with another person? How is it, you know, how appropriate am I talking to other individuals about this stuff? Again, going back to that story I shared before, the Aziz Ansari situation, you know, is it okay if I, you know, just keep asking until someone has sex with me? No, it's not. You know, that's inappropriate, you know. And again, we're not just talking about forced sexual assault in a back alley with a knife. You know, again, it's regular dating, everyday situations that we're in our behavior towards each other. Yeah, again, no one wants to think that what they're doing is inappropriate, but we need to take a step back and realize that in a healthy, you know, relationship, romantic or sexual or anyone, friend relationship, if we're putting another person in a situation where we have to convince them to do something, then we really need to think about our actions and how appropriate that is, right? Nobody should want to do anything unless, again, they enthusiastically consents to that, you know, activity. All right, so it was mentioned a little bit before. This is a big part, you know, this in itself is a part of the conversation around rape culture and myths. What are some of the potential effects of victim blaming? It was mentioned before, but we didn't really get into, you know, when there's a victim blaming situation, when someone's sexually assaulted, that adds to the trauma, right? So what are some of the potential effects of victim blaming, both on the survivor, but also on society as a whole? Let's talk about that.
I'll start this off. So I know that Jenna mentioned before about this like not ideal, but like this image of like people who get sexually assaulted. And I think that like that type of like victim blaming and like identifying kind of like the ideal or the average or the normal, let's say, that's really like damaging to everybody, because let's say like I don't identify as a gender, I don't identify as a sexuality or etc., like whatever other personal identities you might have. if you don't fall within those, you're kind of less likely to report or to even open up to somebody about that. Like, I know that we've talked about like men before, and men and sexual assault, or people who don't identify as men or women or whatever your gender identity is, that they tend to feel more insecure about reporting stuff. And also, like, kind of like Amir was talking about before, about how like men like might not be deemed as like manly enough if they do get sexually assaulted. And it's like what you were talking about before, Joe. It's kind of like toxic masculinity that kind of prevents people from reporting, or at least from people identify as men as reporting. Then also, like, for society, like, it feeds into the whole, like I was talking about before, like the don't get raped mindset of kind of this whole thing that builds off from victim blaming.
Yeah, building off what Cassandra said about reporting, like that's a really important thing to talk about, because most victims don't report because they're afraid that they won't be believed or that they'll be blamed for the assault. And I believe rape is only reported 25% of the time. Like that's really, really low. So obviously something's wrong in society. So victims who are blamed like for their assault kind of experience, it's called secondary victimization, where they're re-traumatized of what happened and now they're not being believed, so they're questioning their self and everything like that. So it kind of increases their risk for suicide, PTSD, depression, anxiety. So on the individual level, that's how it affects the victim. But also, if they're not reporting it, they're not going to get the resources that they need. They're not going to recover from the assault. And it can take years and years and years to recover from sexual assault on your own. So for society, it's important that victims are validated for their experiences and receive help that they need so that they're able to get back on their feet, because it costs a lot of money. For like sexual assault itself costs America millions and millions of dollars, because people don't go to work because of the assault. They can't go to school. Like they can't do, like they just can't live their life because they're so stuck with like reliving the assault over and over with no help to get over it. So I just think it's really important that formally they receive support, but also informally, like they're able to speak to their friends, they're able to talk to their family and not be afraid that they're going to be blamed for the assault. So victim blaming just really is so detrimental to victims, and it's important to understand what victim blaming is and how to avoid it.
I'm glad you brought that up. Oh, I'm sorry. Cassandra, continue.
I'll just say this real quick and then I'll let you continue on, Rebecca. I just want to say that, kind of like tagging along what Jenna was just saying, that like identifying as somebody who is a victim of sexual assault can also be difficult when we do have this image of like who gets sexually assaulted, like, and like this victim blaming kind of thing, then it might be hard for somebody who lived through it to then identify as I was a victim and this happened. That also kind of plays into the lack of reporting, because a lot of people don't identify themselves as that or don't come to terms that they were a victim until much later.
Yeah. What I was going to say is I completely agree with both of what you were saying. For myself and my day-to-day work, there's lots of different hurdles for survivors, and the potential for being victim blamed is definitely a very prevalent and tough hurdle. A lot of the students I work with, that is a big concern of, if I talk to a police officer, is this police officer going to believe me or understand me, or are they going to say something that's going to just make me feel even worse? Or, okay, I'm going to take action from the university. Is the university going to listen and understand? And even though I feel like our university and our police do a great job of not falling into those pitfalls of victim blaming, I can't blame them for having that fear. We see it all the time in different experiences, and some students unfortunately even experience it at home when they do try to explain what happened, or when they turn on the news. My favorite is, it's my least favorite, when I hear a newscaster talking about a story of sexual assault. I often hear the phrase, "This is horrible that this happened, but," and then it's immediately followed up with something very victim blaming and, you know, kind of taking apart pieces that they shouldn't even need to. And another thing I've experienced too is there's no perfect victim. A lot of times in these situations, the person might not have been doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. Maybe there was something else illegal going on, or other behaviors that they were doing that they're fearful other people can misconstrue. And it's really important that it doesn't matter, it almost doesn't matter what the other person was doing. If it occurred, it's okay that they were doing maybe other stuff that they weren't. So for instance, I hooked up with this person in the past and it was consensual, but this time wasn't. Is someone going to say, hey, you're just having regrets or things like that? No, obviously consent changes. Or things like, hey, I was drinking a lot of alcohol and I'm underage and I'm really, really scared now to say anything because people are going to say, well, why were you drinking? Okay, maybe technically that person wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, but they weren't inviting this to happen. It still doesn't make it okay. If anything, if they're under the influence, it increases the chances of this not being consensual. Yeah.
I agree, Rebecca. There's this
Yeah.
like sense of like victim precipitation. Like you were doing something illegal at the time. You were out late at night by yourself. You were provoking the offender by flirting with them. You know, like just things that a victim does that makes them almost responsible for their victimization. And the problem with this is that there was research, like bad research, that kind of backed this up in the early 19th century, but early 20th century. So it's kind of like, not that it's not our fault, but people kind of still believe this bad science, and it's been so socialized into our lives that we think it's true. And it's obviously not, because the offender still committed sexual assault, whatever the victim was doing at the time. They didn't want to be sexually assaulted. No one wants to be raped. That's all another rape we've met. Women secretly want to be raped. That's literally the most untrue thing I've ever heard, because I don't know, whenever I'm walking at night or whatever, I'm by myself in a vulnerable situation, like that's always in the back of my mind. Like, oh my God, someone could grab me right now. Like, what could happen to me? So I think it's really important to understand that victims don't want to be sexually assaulted. That is never the case. So whatever you're trying to say, if it places like any responsibility on the victim, like you kind of need to take a step back and be like, hey, that probably wasn't true.
To go a little bit off of what you guys were saying, I think survivors, they really do tend to get into a habit where they feel that they know they didn't want it to happen. They feel that it was wrong, but they think about things like, Rebecca, you were saying, like, I was drinking, I was flirting with him, so maybe it is my fault. They get into that whole mindset and they just completely toss it aside that they were taken advantage of, like, regardless of whatever led up to it or whatever, it's not your fault. If you didn't want it, you didn't want it.
Going off of Rebecca, well, everybody basically, it's like people try to justify that so much and try to blame everybody else. It's like they're acting like they deserve to be raped, which is totally not true at all. Nobody deserves that. And I hope people really do understand that, like, you are putting somebody else through this trauma and through a situation that they don't want to be in the first place.
It goes back to with rape culture, and I mentioned before, I feel like there's two major components of it: the trying to move the burden of responsibility on the victim, and then also normalizing this. An example of this really odd normalizing violence that we've, as a group, decided that's just so backwards is the use of victim blaming even more. This is probably one of the few crimes where we engage in that form of really pervasive victim blaming. It would be the same thing as hearing a story of someone like, yeah, I was walking one day and I was robbed and they took my wallet, and turning around and saying, well, what were you doing walking around with a wallet? And I mean to laugh because it sounds so ridiculous in that situation, but someone will feel very comfortable saying something very similar when it involves sexual violence.
So we have a couple great questions actually in the chat that folks have asked that I want us to answer for them. So I think these are good conversation starters as well. So the first one being, if you experience a situation that you find off-putting or murky around consent, how would you recommend opening dialogue about it with the other person, especially for men who in hindsight fear their actions may have been inappropriate?
That's a hard one, but a good one. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, honestly, just have an open conversation about it. Just be like, hey, you said this or you did this and that made me uncomfortable. Please don't do it again, or here's a way to avoid it, type of thing. I know like the conversations are like weird and uncomfortable, but it's really important in order to have like a healthy relationship. So if you can't have that conversation, then maybe you shouldn't be with that person just because they make you uncomfortable and they're not it. And there's probably someone out there better for you. So if you don't want to have the conversation, don't have it and just not be around that person if that's what makes you feel happy.
I think also on like the opposite end of the coin, if you yourself notice that you might have done something that is kind of questionable, you're like, oh, I don't know if what this thing made that person uncomfortable. I don't know if this person took what I said this way. Just kind of addressing it and be like, hey, like I've been thinking about this for a little bit, and I realized that the other day I said this or I did this, and it kind of made me question if that was something that was acceptable, and kind of invite that person to like have their own dialogue with you in their terms, be like, to say if they were uncomfortable or not, but kind of welcoming the idea that it's okay to not be uncomfortable if you did something that was in the wrong.
That's really good ways of putting it, and I agree. And I was saying at first it's tough because it's hard to have these kind of conversations, and it sounds like the person was also asking, how do I get started with one? I don't know if there's the best way to get started. Sometimes it can even just be of, hey, I just wanted to check in. This has been bothering me. I don't know if it's been bothering you. I'd like to talk about it. And I think your partner, if anything, would be really honored and happy that, hey, this person's taking a moment to check in with me and make sure I'm doing okay, and if there's something we need to work on.
I think another important thing is, like, I know for myself, it's sometimes hard for me to address another person if they've done something that has hurt me or bothered me. So I try to remind myself to not invalidate my own feelings. So don't use a passive tone. Don't say things like, well, you kinda, no, say, you did this and this hurt my feelings. This made me feel this way. Don't dial back. Stay firm on how you feel. Don't invalidate your own feelings.
I feel like too, like our generation is like super non-confrontational just because, we've lived behind screens most of our lives. We're able to just text our feelings without really having to see the like face-to-face reaction of a person. So if that makes you feel more comfortable, you can text about it too. Like, I don't see anything wrong with that since that's kind of like how we've been communicating most of our lives. So if you can't have the conversation face to face, there's other options that you can have. And you can also like have one of your friends kind of hype you up before. I do that with my friends, be like, hey, don't accept this. When he says this, say this, like kind of knowing how the conversation's already going to go. So kind of play it out in your head first so that you're more comfortable responding when you're in person.
Great, thank you for your responses. The second question on here, and I'll direct this first and foremost to Rebecca, is can you speak about the differences between confiding in a confidential source versus reporting or speaking to a mandated reporter? Who and where are both of those specifically at Stockton?
Great question. So every environment has different forms of confidential versus non-confidential resources. Here at Stockton, we have 3 different confidential resources, myself or anyone at the WGSE, like the director, Lori Dutton, as well as counselors here at Stockton. And then the last one is some of the selected nurse practitioners through the health services. And what we mean by confidential is that everything you share with us stays with us unless you disclose a plan to harm yourself or another person. We break confidentiality to keep those individuals safe. So if someone was to say, come meet with me in my confidential space, like an office or a Zoom meeting, and they disclosed, hey, last Friday I was sexually assaulted, I wouldn't stop the conversation to say, hey, we need to go get a police officer. We need to go get other departments involved. I would take my time with them, listen, and learn a little more about what's going on and how I can help, and educate them about their reporting options, both on and off campus, as well as supportive measures that could be helpful to them, supportive measures that they don't have to report to get, as well as additional services that could be helpful, like help with their academics or connecting them to a counselor, for instance. Now, almost everybody else on campus is considered a mandated reporter, meaning if, let's say, Joe's raising his hand, if you came up to your professor and you said the same thing in that example, the professor would need to stop you and say, hey, I'm really glad that you're talking about this, but I need you to know I'm a mandated reporter and I need to pass this information along, which for a lot of students can be scary. What does that mean, that it's being passed along? Your information is going to be passed along so you can be taken care of, and someone's going to be reaching out to make sure you're okay, and it's still private, meaning that it's not going to be passed around to lots of different places and people, but the university is going to try to start helping you and addressing it. And then maybe someone like myself will also become involved to meet with you. There's advantages to each one. An advantage of meeting with a confidential resource first is you get to take your time even more with deciding which pieces you want to do, which pieces you don't want to do. When you report to a mandated reporter, they still won't take actions without your permission, but it does mean that the circle of people who know will grow a little more. And there will be people reaching out to offer supports. Does that answer the question in full, or am I missing any pieces?
I think that was it. And I'll add, as a mandated reporter who has been reported to, I will add that, in the situations I've been in, a lot of students confide in me and they'll come and talk to me about stuff. So, yeah, as Rebecca said, if somebody starts telling me something, I stop them and I tell them, hey, listen, whatever you're about to tell me, I have to report it, and the situations have, resulted in that. So if you were to report it to an RA or professional staff member, right? I work in the Office of Student Development. So if you talked to one of us, I typically immediately start by telling the person, hey, listen, obviously I have to, I go through the reporting and how we have to do that. But the most important thing for me, not just as a staff member at Stockton, but as a person who wants you to get the support and help that you need, is, I'm going to walk you over to Rebecca's office so that you can talk with them about your options, what this looks like if you do want to move forward in terms of filing, whatever all your options are, and particularly, making sure that you get, counseling and support and you get to talk to people, right? So, and that's typically what the situation looks like, and you go from there. And they're wonderful to talk to, obviously. It's why I brought Rebecca on. They're the experts in the subject and in supporting you as students in these situations. So it's really important. I think that answered the question.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wrap up here, I do want to go around. We have 9 minutes left. If we can go around and just everybody share, if you have any additional, just in conclusion, comments, things that you just want to share, you want people to know or understand. Let's go around and kind of give our final comments. So whoever would like to start.
I can start. I just think one of the most important takeaways is that the extent of sexual assault and rape is really wide reaching, and it affects a lot of people every year, and people that you don't even know that could have been a victim. So it's important to kind of always make sure that you're being respectful in every conversation that you have, because it's not something that people often share or maybe will share with you. So just kind of having that culture of respect, of just understanding that people have these victimizations and how terrible that they may be. So trying to avoid rape myths and victim blaming statements altogether.
I would say, like, the rape culture is a thing. It's not a myth, and that locker room talk and all the jokes is not a joke. Don't joke about it, because there's plenty of people out here that have gone through it. So definitely be aware of yourself and aware of other people. You can definitely see people's body language with certain conversations. So definitely just try to make sure that you make people feel comfortable around you, and don't make sure that you don't make anybody uncomfortable, and don't put anybody in a situation that they don't want to be in as well.
I think I'd just like to say, simply to just educate yourselves on the topic and to listen to survivors, because I feel like however you identify, like even myself as, a young lady, but I've never experienced that, and it would be easy for me to slip into habits of maybe victim blaming. So listen to them, because you truly don't understand unless you've been in that position.
I feel like it's also really important that, like, as generations kind of progress, we become more progressive, and I think that it's really important for us individually, like as an individual like level, to be educated. I think that's a really big part, and also to be mindful of what we're doing. So like correcting some of the things we say, maybe taking some microaggressions out of our dialogue, and really like when we're like eventually, if we choose to become parents, when we're fostering our next generation, to really make sure that we're instilling the ideals that kind of we missed out on as like our generation. Kind of like, I know a big thing right now is like with people with young children, not forcing them to give affection to any family members, because like we said before, like sexual violence does happen in a familial setting. So kind of making sure that your child or whoever knows that it is okay to deny giving affection to somebody if you feel uncomfortable or just don't want to. I feel like that's really important to kind of foster respect, and to also foster the idea that it's okay to say no, because I know that a lot of times people have a hard time saying no. And that kind of goes back into the whole coercion kind of thing, and just really making sure that we're kind of putting like like stopping the problem kind of from like a young age, so that way when they grow up they kind of know that, hey, like that was a no, no means no, kind of like, the elementary things we were taught but kind of like been untaught as societies has kind of grown older.
That's great. For myself, I think if anyone is listening and wondering, okay, so we've talked a lot about rape culture, what can I do to deconstruct it in my own day-to-day life? I will say attending this panel was already a great step in the right direction. I was very excited when I was invited to this. These types of conversations and participating in them are huge for working on this topic. And then for anyone listening who's thinking about working on this more, I would challenge you to challenge yourself as well as those around you a little more. Think about the media that you're consuming, your language and behaviors you might be doing that could be a bit problematic, even if you didn't mean for them to be so. And just remember too, especially we got things like Thanksgiving coming up where a lot of people go home and they're around other people. If you're around friends and family and they do make these statements, your silence is usually interpreted as acceptance of what they're saying, an endorsement of what they're saying. And it can be really hard of how do I push back when my friend says a rape joke? What do I do in those situations? And I'm not saying you need to freak out and get really aggressive. Anything you do that shows you don't appreciate that joke, even just saying not funny, is huge. That is a great way to challenge forms of rape culture and sexual violence in your day-to-day life. And those are huge, beautiful steps.
Anyone else? I will conclude by saying I'll echo what Rebecca just said, but I'll also say simply respect people, respect their autonomy, respect their opinions, respect their bodies, and don't, just understand that, right? And if we could start from that point, then we can all do better. I want to thank everybody who joined us today on this panel. Once again, I appreciate each and every one of you, and for sharing today. I hope that those that are watching this found this very valuable. This is a good, good starting point, the conversation, and hopefully this continues. And this is not the only program that you attend or conversation that you have. And we will end there. So again, thank you everybody, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone.